The last message from my granddaughter came in at 9:17 p.m. "Don't wait up, Nana. It's just a party." I read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand the words, but because something in them felt rehearsed, too neat, too calm. The house was noisy that night. Television on, my son pacing between calls, my daughter-in-law folding laundry while scrolling on her phone. Everyone busy, everyone convinced everything was fine. I was the only one standing still. Her room light was off, her bed untouched. The perfume she always sprayed before going out still lingered in the air. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and held her pillow the way I used to when she was little, and had bad dreams. I told myself not to interfere. I told myself she was grown now. I told myself I had no proof. But when you reach my age, proof stops being the thing you wait for. I remembered every time someone had said it's probably nothing. Right before it became something, I picked up my phone, put it down, picked it up again. I knew if I called, I would sound like an old woman who didn't understand the world anymore. And if I stayed silent, I would be an old woman who had failed to protect the one thing she loved most. That was the moment I made a choice. Not as a grandmother, but as a woman who refuses to look away. I reached for my coat to understand why I didn't hesitate that night. You have to understand the quiet role I had been living in for years. I live in the same house as my son and his family, but most days it feels like I live slightly to the side of it. Not outside it, just not in the center anymore. The house wakes up early. Alarms, coffee machines, hurried footsteps, doors opening and closing. Everyone moving with purpose, already late for something. I move slower. I always have. Not because I can't move fast, but because I don't need to anymore. I make breakfast most mornings. Nothing fancy. Eggs, toast, sometimes oatmeal. I set the table, even when I know no one will sit at it. Old habits don't disappear just because they're no longer noticed. My son thanks me, usually without looking up from his phone. My daughter-in-law smiles, already thinking about the day ahead. They're not unkind. They're just occupied. Their lives are full in ways mine no longer is. I used to matter differently. When my son was young, every decision passed through me. Every fever, every scraped knee, every worry. I was needed then. Needed loudly, needed urgently. Motherhood doesn't prepare you for how quietly that need fades. Becoming a grandmother felt like a second chance at usefulness. And for a while, it was. I picked the children up from school, helped with homework, learned their schedules better than anyone else in the house. I knew which days they had tests, which mornings they woke up anxious, which afternoons they pretended they weren't tired. My grandson still comes to me without thinking. He drops his backpack at my feet and tells me about his day in no particular order. He hasn't learned yet to hide his worries behind independence. My granddaughter used to be the same. When she was younger, she'd crawl into my bed on weekend mornings and whisper secrets like they were precious things only I could be trusted with. She told me who she liked, who hurt her feelings, what scared her. I listened. I always listened. College changed that, not in the way people complain about. She didn't become rude. She didn't become distant in an obvious way. She became careful. Careful with her words. Careful with her phone. Careful with what she let show on her face. Careful is easy to miss if you're busy. I noticed because I wasn't. She stopped leaving her phone on the kitchen counter, started replying to messages with practiced cheerfulness. Her laughter came quicker now, but left sooner. Small things. The kind of things you don't bring up without sounding ridiculous. I tried once. Just once. I mentioned she seemed tired lately. My daughter-in-law waved it off gently. "College is exhausting," she said. "She's fine." My son nodded. He trusts his wife. I don't blame him for that. After that, I stayed quiet. Older women learn quickly what happens when they speak too often. We become worriers. Overprotective, out of touch. So we learn to observe instead. Observation becomes a kind of survival. I watched how my granddaughter dressed for parties. Not scandalous. just uncertain. I watched how she checked her reflection twice before leaving, like she was preparing for something she couldn't name. I watched how she avoided my eyes when she said, "I'll be back late." And I told myself the same thing everyone else did. This is normal. This is growing up. This is none of my business. Still, instinct doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It settles in your chest and waits. My daughter-in-law and son are good parents. I believe that. They work hard. They want the best for their children. But love mixed with exhaustion can turn into neglect without anyone meaning for it to. They trusted the world more than I did. Maybe because they hadn't lived long enough to see how quietly danger arrives. I have. I've lived through decades of things people thought would never happen to them. Accidents, regrets, moments that only made sense afterward. Experience doesn't make you fearless. It makes you cautious. That's what people mistake for anxiety. I didn't want to be a problem. I didn't want to be that grandmother. So I folded laundry, made dinner, asked harmless questions, stayed within the lines drawn for me. But some nights, when the house finally went quiet and everyone was asleep, I'd lie awake thinking about how much responsibility had been handed to a young woman who still needed guidance, and how little anyone was really watching. That night, when the message came, "Don't wait up, Nana, it's just a party," all of that quiet observation came rushing forward at once. It wasn't panic that made me uneasy. It was familiarity. The familiarity of knowing how often the words "just a party" come before stories no one wants to tell later. I stood in the hallway, the house alive with noise and distraction, and realized something painful and simple. Everyone else believed everything was fine because they needed it to be. I didn't need it to be fine. I needed it to be safe. And for the first time in a long while, I understood that staying quiet might cost more than speaking ever could. After that night, I paid closer attention, not in a suspicious way, but in the way you do when you love someone and sense they're caring more than they're saying. My granddaughter didn't change overnight. That's the part people don't understand. Trouble rarely announces itself. It slips in quietly, wearing familiar clothes, using familiar words. She still came home, still said goodnight, still kissed my cheek when she passed me in the hallway. But the pauses grew longer. Her smiles came quicker, like she was eager to move past questions before they could form. She stopped telling me where she was going. Not entirely. She'd say, "out with friends," or "just studying," the way people speak when they've practiced the sentence in advance. There was no defiance in her voice, just caution. I noticed how often her phone vibrated, and how rarely she answered it in front of anyone. I noticed how she stepped outside to take calls, even when the weather was cold. I noticed how she'd sit at the table scrolling through messages while barely touching her food. These weren't crimes. They weren't even accusations. They were patterns. College has a way of widening the world very quickly. New freedoms, new faces, new expectations. Young people are told it's the time to experiment, to say yes, to figure things out. That message comes without much guidance about how to say no. I remembered my own youth, how easily attention can feel like affection when you don't yet know the difference. How being wanted can blur into being used if no one is watching closely. I wanted to ask her more. I wanted to sit her down and say, "You can tell me anything." But I also knew how that can sound, coming from someone my age. Like a lecture waiting to happen. So instead, I listened. I listened to what she didn't say. I listened to the way her voice changed when certain names came up. I listened to the way she laughed too loudly when she mentioned parties. I listened to the small sigh she let out when she thought no one was paying attention. Once, I overheard her on the phone late at night. She was whispering, her voice tight. I didn't catch the words, but I caught the tone. It wasn't excitement. It was pressure. The next morning, I asked if she was sleeping enough. She smiled and said, "I'm fine, Nana," the same words everyone else used. My daughter-in-law noticed none of this. Or maybe she noticed and trusted it would resolve on its own. She was always busy. Meetings, Deadlines, commitments stacked on top of one another. When you're running that fast, stillness looks like safety. My son worked late most nights. When he was home, he tried to make up for it with jokes and affection. He believed presence, even brief, was enough. I don't blame them. But love without attention can miss a lot. There was one afternoon that stayed with me. My granddaughter came home earlier than expected. Her eyes were red. Not from crying, she said, but from allergies. She went straight to her room and closed the door. I stood in the hallway, holding a folded towel, listening to the quiet on the other side. I knocked once. Gently. "Everything okay?" I asked. There was a pause. Then, "Yeah, just tired." I believed her because I wanted to, but something inside me shifted. Not fear, not yet. Awareness. That's when I realized how little margin for error young people are given when they're trusted too quickly and guided too little. They're expected to manage adult situations with unfinished emotional tools. And grandparents like me are expected to step back. That's what I tried to do. I told myself she needed space. I told myself college is messy. I told myself she'd come to me if something was truly wrong. But instincts don't argue. They don't debate. They observe and record. Every small detail became part of a picture I didn't want to finish assembling. And when the invitation to that party came, casually mentioned over dinner, approved with a distracted nod, I felt the last piece slide into place. I didn't say anything then. I just watched her carefully as she got ready. The way she hesitated before choosing what to wear. The way she checked her phone and frowned. The way she avoided my eyes when she said she'd be late. That was the moment I understood something clearly. Whatever was waiting for her out there wasn't harmless, and whatever happened next would test how much silence I could live with. People often think silence means uncertainty. It doesn't. Most of the time, silence is made of memory. I stayed quiet because I remembered what it was like to be young, and convinced that older voices couldn't possibly understand the world as it is now. I remembered rolling my eyes at warnings that felt outdated, exaggerated, or unnecessary. I remembered wanting freedom more than guidance. I was once a young woman too. I didn't grow up sheltered. I made choices I wouldn't repeat, and I learned lessons the hard way. That's part of why I recognized the signs in my granddaughter. Not because I was wiser than her, but because I had once been just as certain I could handle things on my own. Motherhood teaches you humility long before it teaches you authority. When my son was young, I worried constantly. I hovered, I corrected. I tried to protect him from every possible mistake. And like many mothers, I confused control with care. It took years, and more than a few painful arguments, for me to realize that protection only works when it leaves room for trust. I promised myself I wouldn't repeat those mistakes as a grandmother. I promised I wouldn't interfere unless it truly mattered. And that promise weighed on me heavily now. I knew how quickly concern can turn into resentment when it's delivered poorly. I knew how easily good intentions can push people away. I didn't want my granddaughter to stop talking to me altogether, so I chose patience. Patience is a word people like to praise, but they rarely talk about the cost of it. Patience means watching someone walk toward uncertainty and resisting the urge to pull them back before they stumble. It means accepting that love sometimes looks like restraint. I also stayed quiet because of how my role had changed. I was no longer the decision maker. I wasn't the authority in the house. I didn't have the right, socially or emotionally, to intervene without being asked. That's the unspoken rule once children grow and parents age. You're expected to support, not steer. I felt that boundary every time I opened my mouth and then closed it again. There were moments when I nearly spoke up, when I rehearsed sentences in my head, softening them, making them sound less like warnings and more like observations. But each time, I saw the same reaction before it even happened. Polite smiles, reassurance, dismissal. She's fine. You worry too much. Things are different now. Maybe they are, but human vulnerability hasn't changed as much as people like to believe. What truly kept me quiet, though, was fear. Not fear of being wrong, but fear of being right. Because if I spoke and something still happened, I would have to live with knowing I saw it coming and couldn't stop it. And if I spoke and nothing happened, I would become the grandmother who cried danger where there was none. At my age, reputations settle quickly. You don't get many chances to change how people see you. So I watched. I waited. I told myself I would act only if the line was crossed, only if I was certain. But certainty is a luxury danger doesn't offer. Looking back, I see how unfair that expectation was, to her and to myself. How much pressure I placed on silence simply to remain acceptable. Still, I believed I had time. That belief ended the night she walked out the door and said, "Don't wait up." She said it kindly, lightly, without suspicion. And in that moment, I realized something with a clarity that startled me. If I stayed quiet any longer, I wasn't being patient. I was being absent. And absence, I knew from experience, has consequences no one intends. That's when the question changed. It was no longer should I interfere. It became, can I live with myself if I don't? The evening didn't feel important when it began. That's how most turning points arrive, quietly, without ceremony. Dinner was ordinary. Conversation drifted between work schedules and weekend plans. The television played in the background, loud enough to fill the spaces no one wanted to notice. My granddaughter mentioned the party the way you mentioned the weather. Some people from campus are getting together tonight. No details, no excitement, just information offered in passing. My daughter-in-law nodded while rinsing dishes. My son asked what time she'd be back, already half turned toward his phone. She shrugged and said, "Late." That was enough for them. I watched her closely then, studying the small things people think don't matter. The way her shoulders tightened when she said it. The way she glanced at her phone immediately after, like she was waiting for permission or instruction from somewhere else. I wanted to ask who would be there. I wanted to ask if she felt safe. I wanted to remind her that she could call me at any hour, no explanations required. Instead, I said nothing. She went to her room to get ready. I could hear drawers opening and closing, the soft thud of shoes on the floor. Music played low, something with a steady beat that made the room feel restless. When she came back into the hallway, dressed and ready, I felt the familiar pull in my chest. Not disapproval, not judgment, concern. She looked older somehow, not in appearance, but in posture, like someone trying to step into a role they weren't fully comfortable wearing. "You look nice," I said. She smiled, relief flickering across her face for just a second before disappearing again. "Thanks, Nana." That smile stayed with me long after she left. The front door closed behind her with a sound I'd heard thousands of times before. Ordinary. Final. I returned to the living room and sat down, folding my hands in my lap. The house felt louder after she was gone, as if the television and voices were working harder to distract us from her absence. I tried to read. The words blurred together. I tried to watch the screen. None of it held my attention. Time passed strangely. Stretching, compressing. Minutes felt longer than they should. My phone sat on the table beside me, face down, like an accusation. I told myself to wait. I told myself she was with friends. I told myself young people go out and come home all the time without incident. Still, I noticed every hour that passed. 9 o'clock. 10. At 9:17, her message arrived. "Don't wait up, Nana. It's just a party." I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't the message itself. It was the timing, the precision of it. Like it had been sent because someone had reminded her to send it. I typed a reply, deleted it, typed again, "Call me if you need anything." I erased that too. I didn't want to sound like a warning bell ringing in the quiet. I didn't want to embarrass her. I didn't want to make myself a problem. So I placed the phone back on the table and waited. Around me, The house settled into its nighttime rhythm. My son went to bed early, exhausted. My daughter-in-law followed not long after. Doors closed. Lights went out. I was alone with my thoughts. I tried to sleep, but sleep refused me. I lay there listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the hum of appliances, the ticking clock, sounds that usually comforted me. That night, they felt hollow. At some point, I got up and walked to my granddaughter's room. I didn't go in. I just stood in the doorway, looking at the empty bed, the desk cluttered with notebooks and pens, the jacket draped over the chair. The room smelled faintly of her shampoo. I stood there longer than I meant to. That was when instinct stopped whispering. It spoke clearly. It told me this night was different, that waiting quietly was no longer an act of trust. It was a risk. I went back to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and picked up my phone again. My hands were steady. My heart was not. And in that moment, I knew that whatever I chose next would change how this story ended. I didn't rush. That's important to say. Panic clouds judgment, and judgment was the one thing I couldn't afford to lose. I put on my coat slowly, slipped my phone into my pocket, and sat for a moment at the edge of the bed, listening to my breathing until it steadied. I told myself I wasn't going to cause a scene. I told myself I was simply going to check. I told myself that if I was wrong, I would turn around and come home quietly. The address wasn't hard to find. She had mentioned the building once before, casually, the way young people assume adults won't remember details. But I do. I always have. The campus looked different at night. Louder. Less defined. Groups of students moved in clusters, laughter spilling into the open air. Music pulsed from somewhere I couldn't see, the sound heavy and insistent. I parked farther away than I needed to and walked the rest of the way. My legs protested slightly, but I ignored them. Age teaches you which pains matter and which ones can wait. The building itself wasn't alarming. That surprised me. It looked ordinary enough. Brick walls, windows glowing warmly from the inside. If I'd passed it during the day, I wouldn't have thought twice. That's the thing about danger. It doesn't always look dangerous. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand resting on the door longer than necessary. I didn't belong here. That much was clear. I was older than everyone else by decades, my presence an interruption. But I went in anyway. The noise hit me first. Music, voices overlapping, laughter sharp and unchecked. The air smelled of alcohol and something sweet I couldn't place. People crowded the rooms, drinks in their hands, bodies moving too close together. No one paid me much attention. That, too, surprised me. Older women are often invisible in places like that. I scanned the room slowly, carefully. Faces blurred together at first. I moved to the side, letting groups pass, my eyes searching for one familiar shape among many strangers. Then I saw her. She was standing near the kitchen, her back against the counter, a cup in her hand she hadn't lifted in some time. Someone stood close, too close, talking animatedly, leaning in as though proximity could replace consent. Her smile was fixed, polite, strained. I watched the way her fingers tightened around the cup, the way she nodded at things she wasn't really agreeing with, the way she glanced toward the door and then back again, like she was measuring distance. That was when my chest tightened, not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. No one was watching her. The people around her were busy with their own conversations, their own laughter. This wasn't chaos, it was neglect. I moved closer without hurrying. As I approached, I caught fragments of conversation, compliments that lingered too long, suggestions dressed up as jokes, a hand brushing past her arm and not moving away quickly enough. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just pressure. I stepped beside her and said her name. The relief on her face was immediate and unmistakable. It crossed her features before she could hide it. "Nana," she said, her voice lighter than it had been all evening. "What are you doing here?" I came to check on you. I replied simply. I didn't look at the person standing too close. I didn't need to. She's leaving with me. I added, my voice calm, steady, non-negotiable. There was a pause, a moment of surprise. Then a shrug. Sure, someone said. No problem. That was it. No confrontation. No raised voices. Just indifference. And somehow, that hurt more than resistance would have. As we walked toward the door, I felt her body tense beside mine, like she was bracing for an argument that never came. Her hand slipped into mine without a word. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper, real. We didn't speak at first. We just stood there, the noise muffled behind us, both of us breathing a little too fast. I didn't do anything wrong, she said suddenly. I know, I answered. It got weird, she added, her voice small now. I know, I said again. That was when I realized how close we had come to something neither of us could undo, and how quietly it could have happened if I hadn't walked through that door. We sat in the car for a moment before I turned the key. She stared straight ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The streetlights cast soft shadows across her face, and in that quiet space, the weight of what had almost happened finally settled between us. You don't have to explain, I said gently. She shook her head. I think I do. So she talked. Not all at once, not with dramatic detail, just fragments. Someone she'd met on campus, an invitation that sounded harmless, the expectation that she'd drink more than she wanted to, the feeling that leaving would be rude, the pressure to stay agreeable. None of it shocked me. What shook me was how familiar it all sounded. I listened without interruption, without correction, without advice. That's something age teaches you. Sometimes the most protective thing you can do is let someone speak until the truth settles in their own ears. When she finished, I asked one question. Do you feel safe right now? She hesitated. Then she nodded. With you? Yes. That was enough. I drove us home slowly, the radio off, the road quiet. She leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes, exhaustion finally catching up with her. At the house, I didn't send her straight to bed. I made tea. Small routines have a way of grounding people when the world tilts. She wrapped her hands around the mug, the warmth steadying her breath. That's when I made the next decision. Protection doesn't always mean shielding someone from consequences. Sometimes it means making sure the right people know what almost happened. I asked her if anyone at the party had been in a position of responsibility, an organizer, an older student, anyone affiliated with the university. She nodded. There were a couple of people from the student group hosting it. I explained carefully what that meant. Not as a threat, not as punishment, as accountability. I'm not going to do anything without your agreement, I told her. But this shouldn't disappear just because you left safely. She looked down at her tea for a long time. Then she said, I don't want anyone else to feel like that. So we made the call together. Campus safety answered calmly, professionally. They didn't overreact. They asked questions, took notes, promised to follow up. I could feel my granddaughter tense as she spoke, but she didn't back down. She stayed on the line until the end. When it was over, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath all night. I tucked her in like I used to when she was little, not because she needed it, but because comfort doesn't have an age limit. I'm sorry, she whispered. For what? I asked. For not telling anyone sooner. I kissed her forehead. You did tell someone. When it mattered. I went to bed just before dawn, exhaustion settling into my bones. But sleep didn't come easily. I knew it was waiting for me in the morning. Questions, confusion, maybe even blame. Intervening quietly doesn't make you popular. It makes you visible. And visibility has a cost. Still, as I lay there listening to the house breathe, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because I had done what love required of me, without anger, without force, without turning anyone into a villain. I had protected her, and whatever came next, I would face it awake. Morning arrived without ceremony, no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, just the familiar sounds of the house waking up, layered over something new and uncomfortable. Awareness. My son noticed it first, the tension at the breakfast table, the way his daughter moved more slowly than usual, the way I lingered over my coffee, saying nothing. "What happened last night?" he asked eventually, his voice careful. My granddaughter looked at me. I nodded. So she told them. Not everything, not every detail, just enough. The party, the pressure, the discomfort, how she'd called me instead of trying to handle it alone. My daughter-in-law's face shifted as she listened. Confusion giving way to concern, concern tightening into guilt. "Why didn't you call us?" she asked, not accusing, just shaken. "I didn't want to worry you," my granddaughter said quietly. That answer landed heavily in the room. I could feel the questions forming. Why I had gone, why I hadn't waited, why I'd contacted campus safety instead of them. They didn't ask them right away, but they were there, hovering. Later that afternoon, when my granddaughter was resting, my son came to find me in the kitchen. "You scared us," he said. "I know," I replied. "You could have called," he continued. "You didn't have to handle it yourself." "I didn't handle it myself," I said gently. "I made sure the right people were involved." He didn't respond right away. He wasn't angry. He was unsettled. There's a difference. My daughter-in-law avoided my eyes for most of the day. Not out of resentment, but because shame has a way of turning people inward. That evening, I overheard them talking behind a closed door. Low voices, pauses, regret slipping through the cracks. No one apologized to me. Not yet. That's something no one prepares you for. The quiet period after you do the right thing, when recognition hasn't arrived and doubt creeps in. I wondered briefly if I'd overstepped, if I'd embarrassed my granddaughter, if I'd made myself a problem in a house where I was already easy to overlook. But then she came into my room before bed and sat beside me. "They asked me a lot of questions today," she said. "Did you answer them?" I asked. "Yes," she said. I think they're starting to understand." She reached for my hand the way she used to when she was little. That simple gesture settled something inside me. Understanding doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it takes discomfort to make space for it. The house was quieter that night. Not peaceful, just reflective. Like everyone was re-examining assumptions they'd been too busy to question before. I lay awake listening, not with fear this time, but with resolve. Whatever misunderstandings followed, I knew this much. Silence would no longer be my default. Not because I wanted control, but because love requires presence, and presence requires courage, even when it's inconvenient. The follow-up didn't happen all at once. That's another thing people get wrong. They expect accountability to arrive with noise. In reality, it moves quietly, through emails, meetings, and conversations held behind closed doors. A few days after the party, my granddaughter received a message from the university. It was polite, professional. They wanted to talk. She showed it to her parents this time. That was the moment I saw something shift in my daughter-in-law. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. The understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over or dismissed with reassurance. This was real. The meeting took place in an office that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. My granddaughter asked me to come with her. She didn't ask her parents. I didn't feel pride about that. Just responsibility. We sat across from two administrators who spoke carefully, choosing their words with intention. They asked my granddaughter to describe the evening. They listened without interruption. They took notes. No one accused her of anything. No one minimized her experience. That mattered more than I expected. They explained that similar concerns had been raised before. Nothing identical. Nothing that had reached the surface long enough to be addressed properly. Patterns, they called them. Patterns again. By the time we left, the world felt slightly different. Heavier, but clearer. At home, the mood changed further when my son and daughter-in-law began receiving calls of their own. Not alarming ones. Informational. Updates. Requests for cooperation. Reality has a way of becoming undeniable when it arrives in official language. My daughter-in-law sat at the kitchen table that evening, staring at nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Later she found me folding towels. "I should have paid more attention," she said quietly. "I didn't correct her. I didn't reassure her. Guilt has its own work to do." Over the next week, pieces came together. Other students came forward. Some details were confirmed. Some were still under review. No names were spoken at our dinner table. No anger was voiced. Just a growing understanding of how close we had come to something irreversible. My granddaughter became quieter, but stronger. She asked more questions, set firmer boundaries, chose her company more carefully. My son watched her differently now, less distracted, more present. And me? I returned to my routines. Cooking, cleaning, listening. But the air around me had changed. People looked at me when I spoke. Respect doesn't always arrive with words. Sometimes it shows up in pauses, in the way conversations slow to make room for you. That week taught me something important. Danger doesn't always announce itself. And safety doesn't always come from those with the most authority. Sometimes it comes from the ones who are paying attention when everyone else is too busy to look. Change didn't arrive with apologies. It came with behavior. My daughter-in-law began asking questions she hadn't asked before. Simple ones. Who my granddaughter was seeing. What her schedule looked like. Whether she felt overwhelmed. They weren't interrogations, just openings. My son started coming home earlier when he could. He listened more than he spoke. I noticed the way he watched his daughter now, not with suspicion, but with care. Trust was being rebuilt, not because it had been broken, but because it had been incomplete. My granddaughter changed too. She didn't withdraw. She steadied herself. She spoke more clearly. She said no without apology. She learned that discomfort is information, not something to be swallowed for the sake of politeness. Sometimes she came to my room at night and sat with me without saying much. We'd drink tea or sit in silence, our presence enough. One evening, my daughter-in-law joined us. She sat across from me, hands folded, eyes tired in a way I recognized. "I didn't listen," she said finally. I shook my head. "You were busy." "That's not an excuse," she replied. "It's just the truth." That was the closest thing to an apology she offered. I accepted it without ceremony. Respect, I've learned, doesn't come from being right. It comes from being steady when it matters. I didn't become louder after that. I became firmer. When I noticed something, I said it. Calmly. Without accusation. And this time people listened. My place in the house shifted. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. I was no longer just helpful. I was included. My granddaughter hugged me more often now. Not in gratitude, but in recognition. She didn't say thank you for saving her. She didn't need to. We both understood what had passed between us. As weeks turned into months, life settled again. Not into what it had been, but into something better, more attentive, more honest. The kind of balance that only comes after something nearly breaks. And in that quiet return to normal, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not the kind that comes from being praised. The kind that comes from knowing you acted with integrity when it counted. People often think getting older means becoming less useful, less needed, less relevant. I used to believe that too. You watch your children grow into adults. You watch their lives fill with responsibilities that no longer include you in the center. You learn how to step aside without disappearing completely. That balance is harder than it looks. For a long time, I thought my role was to stay quiet and less invited, to offer help without opinion, to love without interference. And there is wisdom in that. But there is also danger in confusing silence with respect. That night didn't turn me into someone new. It reminded me of who I already was. A woman who had lived long enough to recognize patterns, to trust instinct, to understand that harm doesn't always arrive with shouting and broken rules. Sometimes it arrives politely. I didn't save my granddaughter because I was fearless. I was afraid the entire time. I saved her because I knew fear isn't a reason to look away. Age doesn't strip you of responsibility. It sharpens it. You stop acting for approval. You stop worrying about how your concern will be received. You act because love at its core is not passive. My daughter-in-law and I don't talk about that night often. We don't need to. What changed wasn't our words. It was our awareness. She listens more now. So do I. My son still moves quickly through life, but when he slows down, he looks at me differently, not as someone to manage, but as someone to trust. And my granddaughter? She carries herself with a quiet confidence now, not hardened, not closed, just informed. Sometimes she'll catch my eye across the room and smile, and I know she's thinking about that night, about how close things came, about how someone noticed. I didn't teach anyone a lesson. Life did. All I did was refuse to stay silent, when silence could have cost her something she could never get back. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Paying attention is a form of love, and dignity isn't loud. It shows up when it's needed and stays when the noise fades.